Almost a decade ago, my boyfriend, now husband, ended up getting into a pretty serious car accident. And during his recovery, I had to pick up extra shifts wherever and whenever I could, and the only extra shifts available were night shifts at an alternate site that required a long drive. I didn't mind at all, and that's what made me think, wow, maybe I love this guy enough to start a family with him. But it was also on one of these nightly commutes that I went through the single most traumatic experience of my whole life. My route took me through some pretty desolate patches of Arizona, and although I'd climb into my driver's seat with the sun still above the horizon, it'd be full dark outside by about half hour or 45 minutes into the drive. Now, I hated driving at night, and even more so these days because it reminded me of this whole thing. But back then, I was kind of adjusting to the whole routine of grabbing a bucket-sized iced coffee and then listening to my morning playlist at the total opposite side of the day. But then, on this one particular journey, I remember the feeling of horror I felt when, on a particular desolate stretch of road, my engine started to seize up. I didn't know much about cars at the time, I still don't really, but I knew the sounds my car were making were not normal or healthy. Now, being the idiot I was, I didn't do anything but hope the issue would resolve itself, but it didn't. And I don't think that I made it more than a couple of miles further before I started to see either steam or smoke coming out from under the hood. I pulled over and turned off the engine, thinking that if I just left it a few minutes to cool down, I'd be able to start her up again and just keep driving. But when I turned my key in the ignition, the engine did nothing but turn over a few times before dying. I tried a few more times, hoping things would unscrew themselves in there somehow, but nothing worked. And then after letting out a stream of curse words that'd make a sailor blush, I called ahead to work and told them about my engine trouble. Now, my boss wasn't happy, but he wasn't mad either. He just told me to take care of it, get to work whenever possible, and keep him updated on how things were going. I hung up and was just about to call roadside assistance when I noticed a dark-colored van pull in ahead of me. I got this feeling of hope, thinking someone had pulled over to help out. And then when I saw the van back up so it was much closer and watched a guy climb out of his driver's seat, I felt this wave of relief and appreciation, thinking some good Samaritan was going to help me get to work on time. I opened up my car door just as the guy was fully lit up by the headlights, and saw a man in a dark jacket and beanie waving and smiling, all friendly. Arizona nights get cold as heck, so I didn't think it was unusual that he had his hat pulled down to its brow and was all bundled up against that cold. Now, the first thing I said was, "Thank you so much," to which he replied, "No problem," and then asked me if I was having engine trouble. I told him I was, and that his timing was nothing short of a miracle, as I was on my way to work and in a real jam. He made some joke about how cars always pick the worst times to give you trouble like that, and then after explaining that he was a mechanic, he asked me to pop my hood so he could take a look at the engine. Now, once he'd opened up the hood, I joined him in taking a look at that engine, but like I said, I had next to no idea what I was looking at. There was this moment of awkward silence, and so I introduced myself to the guy. Now, he said his name was Clay, and we shook hands, and then he went back to staring at my engine for a couple of seconds under the light of a little flashlight that he had before he said something about how things weren't looking good. When I asked him if he could fix it, or if it was better calling a tow truck, he told me to give him a minute, and then he went back to it for a minute or two before exclaiming, "Aha!" Now, I've never understood car speak, and I guess that was written all over my face too, because the more he talked about what the problem was, the more he got this smile on his face. He cut himself off at one point and asked if I understood what he was saying, to which I obviously said no, and then told him how it was usually my boyfriend who dealt with all the car stuff, and I just drove the thing. Now, the guy laughed and said something about how his wife was the same way, but then instead of trying to break it down so I could understand him, he kept on using all of those super technical words. Now, I guess this might sound kind of hard to describe because how do you put a feeling into words? But the more the guy talked about what was wrong with my engine, the more I got this weird feeling that he was sort of making fun of me. I obviously didn't accuse the guy straight up. After all, I was still under the impression that he was doing me a favor and figured that I was maybe just being paranoid. But then at one point, he used a word that in my head got me thinking, did he just make that up? Now, I let him carry on talking for another minute or so, watching as this big grin grew on his face, and then he used another word that was so on the nose silly that I had to be like, wait, are you making fun of me right now? Now, the guy who called himself Clay gave me this look like he was half hurt and half confused, as if to say, why the heck would I do that? And then right as I was about to apologize, he says, "Hey," and then burst into laughter. He then admitted right to my face that the only reason he stopped was to, and I'm using his words here, mess with me. Now, I half expected him to sort of actually fix my engine once he was done playing his little prank, but he didn't. He just kept on laughing like duping me was the funniest thing in the world. And then I remember asking him, "So, are you even a mechanic, or?" And he acted like that was a punchline to his whole joke. He took a few steps back, bent doubled over, and wheezed with laughter, and I had to stop myself from yelling about what an a-hole he was. I was mad as hell, like so angry I was practically shaking, because who the hell does something like this? But I was also aware that I was a 5'2", 100-pound woman, alone on a dark road with a guy that was clearly getting a lot of joy of screwing with me. And all that came out of my mouth was, "Dude." And then I cut myself off because I knew it was either that or insult the guy so badly that he'd get mad and actually turn on me. Then right as I pulled my phone out and I was about to dial 911 to report a breakdown and some a-hole harassing me, Clay spoke again, and he said something like, Okay, I'm not a mechanic. I admit it. I'm an artist." Now that was the angriest I got with him because I'm thinking, dude, for real? What the hell is wrong with you? Now his laughter slowly petered out and he raised his hand with the palms flat like he was about to apologize for something. But he didn't say sorry. Far from it. He then says, For real, I'm an artist, I swear." And then he started telling me how he made pretty pictures, but not for a living, just for fun. And then I remember how he said, word for word, that he would make a pretty picture by blowing your brains out all over the blacktop. There was a shift right there. This horrible shift from him laughing and me being angry to me being terrified and him enjoying it in this sick, sadistic way. Because right as I looked at my phone to dial 911, the guy pulled a gun from the back of his waistband and pointed at me. "Ah, not so fast." He reached for my phone and took it from my hand, sort of like, "I'll take that." And I wanted to run, to scream, to do something. But I couldn't. The sight of that gun had me frozen to the spot like I'd suddenly turned to stone. It was cold out, really cold, and my brain was telling me, don't move a muscle, don't give him a reason. But still, the shakes started, and they got bad. When he said, "Keys," I was so shook up that all I could say was, "What?" And he went from amused to furious while shouting, "Keys! Where are they?" I stammered out that they were still in the ignition of my car, and then after telling me that I was dead if I moved, he took them from the ignition and tossed them into the darkness of the road. And if that sounded like the perfect time for me to run, it wasn't. He kept the gun trained on me almost the whole time. If I tried to run, I'm 99% sure that I wouldn't be around to write this right now. He must have seen it written all over my face, sort of like, "Why did you do that? My car is busted. Why would you toss my keys away like that?" And seeing it, the big grin found its way to his face again, and he told me how in that kind of situation, it's better safe than sorry. I didn't say a word in reply. I couldn't, not even if I wanted to. As he slammed my car door closed again, he asked, "Who's going to miss you?" And at first I thought he meant sort of like the folks at work, Like if I didn't show up, who was going to notice? So, that's what I said. I told him the people at work would call the cops if I didn't show up, or at least call to tell them where I was. But that's not what he was asking. He was asking who would miss me if he killed me. I started to cry. I thought about my now husband recovering at home, wondering where I'd gone if no one found me, thinking that I'd sort of abandoned him because I couldn't handle taking care of him anymore. I've been picturing what it would be like spending the rest of my life with him, getting married, having kids, growing old together. So when Clay asked me the question, it was like my life flashed before my eyes. Only not just the life I had already lived, but the one he'd taken away from me if he pulled the trigger. I told Clay how my boyfriend would miss me and then started explaining how he'd been in an accident and how I'd been taking care of him and how he needed me. But Clay cut me off by yelling at me to shut up and how he wanted an answer, not my life story. I did as he told me, and then he says, "Who else?" And so I listed my family members, people at work, anyone I could think of. I kept thinking that if I kept on talking, I could buy myself enough time for someone to drive past us, notice what was going on, and call the cops. But it was like he knew no one was coming, because he took his sweet-ass time in pulling out a small notepad and a pen from his jacket pocket, keeping the gun on me the entire time. After he tossed them over to me, he told me to write down my goodbyes to the people who were going to miss me. I didn't. I didn't even touch the paper or pen he tossed down in front of me, not even when he yelled at me to kneel down, and I did. I figured that if I didn't go along with what he was telling me to do, he wouldn't kill me because his little plan wasn't complete. But all I could think to do to stall for time was beg him not to kill me. I tried focusing on the fact that my boyfriend needed me, that we couldn't afford at-home care, stuff like that. I told him he could take anything he wanted, and I meant anything he wanted, as long as he just let me live. I kept expecting him to yell at me again, to tell me to shut up, but he didn't. He got this sick smile again, and he just sort of listened as I sobbed and begged and sobbed some more. He didn't say a word until I asked why he was doing what he was doing, at which point he just said, "I told you. I'm an artist." I don't know why I was expecting him to say anything that made sense. Nothing else did. And then as I'm kneeling there with tears in my eyes, he did that thing with his gun that made it go click before it's about to shoot. I don't know what it's called, maybe locking or loading or cocking it back, but I was so certain that he was about to shoot me that I just shut my eyes. I couldn't look, but I couldn't move either. I just remember sobbing with my eyes clamped shut while begging him not to do it. But all he'd say was, "Open your eyes! Open your effing eyes!" while calling me all these vile things I can't bring myself to repeat. Now, I tried that same tactic of sort of not doing what he said, because the more I delayed his plans, the more chance I had of someone driving past and calling the cops. But then, he said something that made it so I had to do what he said, like I couldn't physically stop myself. He said, "Open your eyes, or I'll make sure they never find you. I'll make sure he thinks you just left." I knew he was referring to my boyfriend, that he was preying on my own true weakness to get me to do what he said. I knew I should have kept on disobeying him, and I know that now more than ever. But at the time, in that moment, I couldn't stop myself. It was like that gun pointed at me was sort of like a magic wand or something, and my body overrode my brain. I opened my eyes, and the way he was smiling when I did, it was almost like it was burned into my brain. It was that face I had nightmares about for literally years afterwards, waking up in a cold sweat after seeing his teeth all jagged and messed up in my mind. I don't think they were actually all that messed up, it was just the way my brain kind of replays the image to match how terrified I was. But then, as I opened them, he said, "Look at me." And I did. He kind of pointed back towards his van and told me, "Now, smile for the camera." I looked, only for a second, but I didn't see anything. I guess it was too dark, or whatever he was recording us with didn't have a telltale red recording light on it. and in fact, I don't even know if he really was making a video or if what he was saying was just another way of messing with me. I guess he enjoyed my reaction though, because he started laughing again, harder than ever. But then even though he was laughing, I still felt sick with fear. I felt this weird relief as he lowered the gun and stopped pointing it at me. I don't fully remember the stuff that he said afterwards. It was all about how dumb I was or looked, how I was pathetic and a crybaby, all the stuff like that, and he said disgusting stuff about the things that he was going to do while watching the footage back, stuff that still sticks out more than the others, but I don't want to repeat for obvious reasons. I could barely move, I could barely speak, but I still managed one last, "Please don't kill me." And he gave me some speech about how it was better for him to leave me alive so I could spend the rest of my life living with the trauma of what had happened. He didn't say those exact words, it was way more protracted and drawn out, but that's essentially what he was getting at. Killing me would be more trouble than it's worth, leaving me with the memories with all the pain and the nightmares that was far more satisfying for him, and so that's what he did. He climbed back into his van and drove off again, but not without giving me a parting gift, one that'd make sure that I couldn't do anything immediately. He said he was going to make sure I couldn't go anywhere, which had me wailing because I thought, this is it. He's actually going to end me. But then instead of just shooting me, he ran up to me and hit me with the gun he was holding. And the hit broke my orbital socket, which explains why it was so painful. And I guess he was trying to knock me out, but it didn't work. I fell backwards, feeling the worst pain of my life throbbing through my head. It didn't knock me out, at least I don't think it did, but I knew better than to get up, run, or even move at all. I knew he wanted to knock me out so he could drive off without me running for help, and so to me, the best thing I could do was play possum and pretend that I was out cold from him hitting me. I remember quite literally begging God to make it a convincing act, to have him believe that I was out cold and I was going nowhere for at least a while. And the reason I still pray today is because it worked. I heard him laugh one last time, and then footsteps on the pavement, and after that there was a sound of a car door slamming, an engine starting, and the guy who called himself Clay took off into the night. I won't go into all the details of how I was rescued because it's mostly me walking along the side of the highway covered in blood, crying and shivering from the cold and the adrenaline dump until I saw headlights coming towards me. I was terrified at first, thinking it might have been Clay coming back to finish me off. But then, when I saw it was an actual Good Samaritan, I burst into tears again out of sheer relief before I climbed into their passenger seat and they called the police for me. Gary, who will forever be my hero, waited with me at the gas station that we found while waiting for the cops and the EMTs to show up. And then it was a case of explaining what had happened, passing on as much detail as possible in the hopes that they might be able to find the guy. And after that, I was taken to the hospital for treatment, which is how I found out something was broken in my skull. And it was there that I waited for my boyfriend to show up, which he did, limping into the ward with a friend of his who had given him a ride at a moment's notice. And that was the icing on the cake, knowing the extent that he'd go to in order to look out for me, and within 18 months, we were engaged to be married, and then we tied the knot around 8 months afterwards once we had the money and the venue we wanted. It made up for the fact that Clay was never found, and I needed something to make up for it because for a long time I used to beat myself up for not being able to recall his license plate number. The doctor said it was most likely a result of the concussion, and that it was pretty normal for people not to be able to remember little details about an event that they sustained a head injury in. But that didn't seem to sink in for me for a long time, and I used to cry sometimes, wondering why I was so dumb that I couldn't even remember the first letter of a number, just that dumb purple cactus that is on all the generic Arizona plates. I'm over it now for the most part. There's just one thing that still bothers me to think about on the rare occasion that it pops into my mind, and that's the fact that out there, somewhere, there's maybe a video of me on my knees, crying and begging for my life while some sick freak gets off on my fear. If that's true, and Clay's never been caught or punished for what he did to me, or has done to God knows how many others, then he might well watch it back sometimes, reliving those sick thrills that he felt the night he mentally tortured me on the side of a dark highway. My name's Rick, and I grew up in Boyle Heights, pretty much the most Latino neighborhood in Los Angeles. Mom and Dad came up from Michoacan before I was born and had me as an anchor baby. Me and Mom were close, but I never knew my dad, and he split when I was still in diapers and actually gave my mom a variation on the old heading out for a pack of smokes line when he told her he was headed out for beer. Now, it must have been a rare brand because I've never seen or met him since. And I dropped out of high school in 10th grade, and while I'd like to be able to say that it was so I could support my mother, I was mostly just sick of the bullcrap. The teachers didn't give a damn that there were kids trying to get me to join gangs, and I was failing every class anyway. So, rather than repeat years and prolong the agony, I quit, and then started working right after. I did stuff like wash cars or haul drywall, and then I worked night janitor shifts at some warehouses downtown. That was probably the worst one because I sometimes had to mop up all the piss and puke from the drunks who slept in the loading docks. The guy who owned the warehouse was really appreciative, and he'd sometimes leave an extra $50 in my pay whenever he heard about a bad one. And that's where I learned how it pays to be able to clean things nobody else wanted to touch. So when a cousin of mine told me how well it pays to be on a cleanup crew that worked crime scenes, my ears pricked up. This wasn't a job working for the cartel or anything crazy like that, getting rid of the evidence and cleaning after the guy they killed. This was a legitimate private company that took jobs cleaning up after someone died in a way that required cleanup. Sometimes it was a shooting, sometimes it was stabbings, sometimes it was ODs where a guy had been left in a sweltering apartment with no air conditioning for like 6 weeks. And when the cops were done, that's when we moved in. Sometimes doing jobs for private citizens, but mostly doing jobs on city contracts. Pay started at $22 an hour, and back around the time I joined, that was more than I could ever expect to earn anyplace else. And then add on the hazard bonuses and all that sweet, sweet overtime pay, and I was practically jumping at the chance to do a job most other people refuse to do. I went down to the office there and filled out some paperwork, and then after about a 2-week class, I was good to go. They taught us about the dangers of bloodborne pathogens, how to bag biohazards, what chemicals eat through carpet stains, and how to wear the Tyvek suit so you don't bring the crap home on your shoes. The instructor was this old Korean dude. He'd been doing it for like 20 years, and he didn't sugarcoat anything. He told us around 1 in 20 of us would walk off the job by the end of our first week, and that a third of us would be gone within a year. We were going to see things that, unless we were cold-blooded psychos, would cause us extreme amounts of distress. We obviously wouldn't see any bodies, but there would be blood, lots of it, and sometimes there would be stuff that used to be blood or used to be skin. It'd be tough work for tough people, but if you could hack the gore, you were golden, and you could make a ton of money without having so much as a GED. On my first day on the job, they threw me and one other guy into a 1-bedroom where some guy had apparently blown his head smooth off. Now, the smell hit me before I even opened the door, and I almost puked in my mask. We didn't have full-on gas masks, just cloth ones, so they didn't even altogether keep the smell out. And that's when I learned to plug my nostrils with Vaseline, and there was no other way to do the work, but we got it done. We cut out the soaked carpet, scraped the walls, and sprayed the enzyme stuff that breaks down the proteins, and the whole job took us 6 hours, but when we finished, the place looked like nothing had ever happened. I was seasoned, and then after the landlord paid the city paid the company, and I got my check that Friday. About 6 months later, I was on a crew with 2 guys named Choi and Randy and our supervisor Frank. Now Frank was hardcore. He was another one who had been on the job for 20 years plus, and while he was definitely crazy in his own ways, he was a good guy, and he was good to work with. We were also very lucky to be working with a guy with that amount of experience, as it helped you get jobs done faster and safer, and safety in a job like that is everything. But on this occasion, when we got a job a little further out, Frank wasn't available. We could still do the job, we'd just be a man down and without all that experience. And then after getting word forensics would be done at around 3 in the morning, we all met up at the depot at around 2:30 and then rolled out maybe 10 minutes later. Some nights it's nothing but hosing down a little blood. Other nights it's a whole apartment full of needles and piss from a tweaker who died in the bathtub. And that night's job was more like the former and involved hosing down an alleyway where some poor hooker had been stabbed to death. We were grateful for what seemed like a simple job, but what we didn't know was how that one was going to turn out to be far from simple. We arrived at the scene a little later than expected, meaning the cops guarding the scene were pretty pissed. We completed the handover, then after they went off to get their donut fix or whatever they were doing, we started suiting up and getting ready to begin cleaning. But then, just as we're about to start, some older dude, this white guy in a dark trench coat, walks up and introduces himself as a local pastor. Now me, Randy, and Choi are just standing there, listening as he talks about being the family pastor of the girl who had been murdered. Apparently they'd heard the news somehow and he'd been the first person they called. He'd also agreed to head over to the scene to take a look at it for them, on the assumption doing so personally would be too damaging and traumatic for them. The girl's parents said that she'd been led astray while she was still in middle school and ended up selling her body and becoming addicted to drugs. They'd be reunited with their daughter for the first time in years at her funeral, but in the meantime, they wanted him to head over to the scene and pray in the spot that their loved one lost their life. Now, the guy looked legit, and he talked legit too, then after telling us the girl's story, we couldn't exactly go telling him to get lost. None of us had the heart to. And so, instead of starting up right away, we gave the guy like 10 minutes to do his thing while we went and got some coffee and donuts of our own. Or rather, not all of us, because someone needed to stay behind and keep an eye on the guy because we could all lose our jobs if someone found out that we just let a guy hang out near a cleanup site without the proper protective clothing. But then, here's the thing. I didn't really give a damn either. I didn't think some man of God was going to be a problem, not given the circumstances, and not given all he'd told us about his connection to the girl's family. And why would I? So instead of standing with him and watching him like a hawk, I decided to just sit in the truck and get a little shut-eye while Choi and Randy walked to a 7-Eleven. But then, as I'm sitting there, on a sort of spur-of-the-moment type thing, I decided to look over at the pastor guy and see how he was doing, only to see that he was past the tape and on his knees. Now, right away, I'm thinking how this dude should not be past the tape, and we'd definitely get in trouble if the bosses found out that that had happened. But I'm also thinking, the dude's a pastor, praying on his knees at what must have been a very emotional time for him, seeing as he was the family's pastor. But then, I see the guy reach forward, right? Like he's sort of sliding his hand across the ground right where all the blood was. And that was a big no-no. Not so much because why the hell would you do that? Because people do crazy things out of grief. But because, and I say this with all due respect for the dead, there was no telling what diseases that girl had. I hopped out of the truck and yelled something like, "Yo, Padre, you can't just go touching stuff like that." Now, I thought yelling at him like that would at least grab his attention for a second, but it didn't. He just stayed kneeling down as he brought the hand that he'd wiped on the ground up to his face. Now, I swear that old Korean instructor of mine would have popped his goddamn pants if he'd witnessed something like that with his own eyes too, and I was pretty worried myself as well. It was probably the most dangerous thing you could do at a crime scene like that, second only to triggering a booby trap or something. So as you can imagine, I wanted to warn the guy that no matter how bad he was grieving, it wasn't worth catching HIV over. Now I shouted over him a second time, saying, "Hey, stop!" as I picked up the pace and started jogging towards him. He stood up as I got close and then turned around as I started to warn him about how dangerous that was. But I don't think I got more than about 3 words out before I saw the blood around his mouth and stopped talking. It was on his lips too, and he had this crazy look in his eyes, but he wasn't like mad or spooked that I'd run up on him. The total opposite, in fact. The guy looked happy, like he'd just done something amazing, when all he'd done was put himself at risk of some seriously disgusting diseases. Now, I knew that he must have been a freak or a head case by that point, so I started yelling at him to get lost before my crew showed back up and we called the cops. Now, we started backing off as soon as I stepped to him, which was a huge relief seeing as I really did not want to fight a guy with a bunch of strange, potentially contaminated blood on him. But his expression didn't change one bit. He seemed really pleased with himself, like he'd done something that he loved to do. But although I'm yelling at him to get the hell away, he didn't turn. He started talking to me instead in some language I couldn't understand. Now, I'm no expert, but I can safely say it wasn't English or Spanish, but it did sound a lot like Italian in that there were a lot of rolling R's and a lot of ch sounds. Now, I met a guy who said it might have been Greek or something like that, but I don't know. Maybe it was. Hell, it might have even been Enochian. Either way, he started pointing at me with his index finger and pinky extended and started saying all this stuff with big eyes and a big smile on his face. I was getting kind of freaked out. Not because I thought the guy was sort of putting a curse on me or something, but because he thought he was putting a curse on me. Now, come to think of it, I guess the real fear came from not knowing at all what the hell he was doing. He didn't seem crazy, and I mean like he wasn't raving and ranting and taking his clothes off kind of crazy. He was able to spin what I'm guessing was this big lie about being the pastor and knowing the family and the tragic past of the dead girl. So there was this sort of horrible overtone of, this guy knows what he's doing. He's just not a rabid dog doing whatever from moment to moment. Now, eventually he did turn and walk away, and the whole time I'm yelling about how I'm going to call the cops or the EMTs or maybe even both because he needed help from all kinds of doctors after what he did, you know? But all he did was walk away, still kind of laughing to himself while speaking in that weird language of his. I couldn't bring myself to call the cops, not until Randy and Choi came back with our coffee and we got our story straight. Now, we didn't want to say the guy talked us into letting him do something so dangerous as we could lose our jobs, so we agreed on the story that he just kind of ran up while we were all distracted. The dispatcher said that she'd send someone over to go looking for the guy, but since he wasn't actually breaking any laws, there wasn't much they could actually do. Now, I questioned that, but the dispatcher explained that the crime scene had already been investigated and sealed off, so all he was really doing was getting in the way of the crime cleanup, which was an annoyance but not a criminal emergency. Instead of looking to arrest him, they were more looking for him to get him potentially checked into an institution for 24 hours for a psych evaluation, and we all agreed that he needed one of those. We got the scene cleaned up, talked about what the hell that guy's problem might have been. Randy joked that I'd had a run-in with a vampire, which was kind of funny at the time, but these days, when I think about it, it creeps me out even more than it did in the moment. I guess that's because it's had all this time to bounce around in my head, with me wondering why the hell he did what he did and take a huge risk like that. I obviously don't think he was a vampire, and even if he was a member of some satanic church or something, that doesn't really scare me. What scared me is how happy he looked, how putting his own health in danger just didn't seem to faze him, and he was just so damned happy that he got to lick some poor girl's blood off his fingers that it brought this wild look of satisfaction to his freakish face. My name's Andy. I'm a professional videographer, and my fiancé likes listening to your podcast while she cooks. Now, I've heard one or two absolute banger stories, and although my fiancé doesn't have anything to contribute, thank God for that, I do. Because even though I've filmed in dangerous high-crime areas of the US and UK, as well as many, many conflict zones all over the world, nothing has frightened me like what happened at an old Welsh castle one night back in 2009. So, back when I was still freshly graduated, I used to advertise on Facebook and in newspapers. I mostly did stuff like weddings and secondary school dances, low-level stuff for what I considered to be reasonable prices. But then one day, I got a message from a guy that immediately piqued my interest, because instead of being soon to be married or a secondary school's head of year, this guy's profile said he was a paranormal investigator. Sixth form dances are nice, but trust me when I say that you can only do so many before they get a bit boring. They're also weirdly hazardous because a drunk sixth former can cover an impressive distance with their projectile vomit, and while it makes for a fantastically disgusting photo, The last thing I want to do is spend the wee small hours cleaning spew off my expensive camera. Now, the same applies to weddings. Some people think that they're Martin Scorsese after a couple of drinks asking, "Let me have a go then." And then they almost drop your camera on the hard stone floor of some rental country house. And that's half the reason the job interested me so much. It'd be the same pay for the same time, but it'd be in a sober environment with a guy who claimed to hunt ghosts for a hobby. Now, I know his family quite well these days, so I don't want to name and potentially embarrass him, so I'll just call the guy Ray, which is the first non-silly name I could really think of. Ray seemed a bit quirky. I mean, a person has to be a bit quirky to call themselves a paranormal investigator, but he also seemed really nice. He explained how the job was at Kidwelly Castle in Wales, which was about 2 hours' drive from where I was based at the time. But Ray said he was willing to pay for my petrol and an overnight stay in a local B&B, which he assured me wouldn't bite into his budget too badly. Now, he was a wealthy guy apparently, operating a large cleaning business in the day while indulging in his preferred hobby of ghost hunting on weekends. Now, I didn't believe in ghosts at the time. I still don't. But like I said, I reckoned hanging around with a ghost hunter and his crew would make for an interesting job, and it did, in a manner of speaking. Just not in the way that I first thought it would. So Ray's team consisted of himself, a personal assistant named Sophie, and a technician named Phil. I put technician in quotes because I don't mean to sound disrespectful here or anything, he just wasn't anything of the sort. He had a few weird-looking detectors with him, things that measured air density or electrical signals, but when I asked how they worked and how they'd help us find ghosts, he gave me a kind of jimble-jamble response that made it clear that he had no real clue. None of that bothered me in the least bit, though. He was a lovely person, just like Ray and Sophie were, and since they were paying me, I was only too willing to provide the best camera work possible, while hopefully having something of a laugh while doing it. I drove out to Wales early on Saturday afternoon and then arrived at Kidwelly on the south coast of Wales just in time for a late pub lunch. And then after a slow pint, Ray and his team arrived and I joined them on the short drive up to the castle. Built by the Norman invaders, it's in ruins these days and for good reason, because as Ray quite accurately informed me, it was the site of over 200 years' worth of battles between the Normans and the native Welsh. It was built, attacked, taken, retaken, besieged, relieved, and then finally destroyed. And while Ray had no doubt that the ghosts of dead soldiers reenacted those ancient battles on a near nightly basis, they weren't our reason for being there. Now, I apologize in advance for the name, and it'll no doubt cause you a bit of trouble pronouncing it, but I'll try and help you out a bit. According to Ray, we'd come to Kidwelly to hunt the ghost of Gwenllian Vergrythydd, a 12th century Welsh princess who led a rebellion against the Normans. Now, I'm not some history buff. I have no idea who he was talking about or how to spell or pronounce her name, but as Ray told me her story, I was captivated. Apparently, Gwenllian was the great-great-great-granddaughter of the High King of Ireland, and her beauty, along with her skill with words, inspired many a man to follow her into battle. She gathered up an army to attack Kidwelly Castle and won herself a couple of battles in the surrounding area. But one thing the Normans were never short of, thanks to constantly conquering and absorbing other forces, was men. And so when she and her army finally marched on Kidwelly itself, the Normans were ready for them, and after her soldiers were soundly beaten, the Normans took Gwenllian captive. Now here's where things get dark. After the Normans captured Gwenllian, they wanted to make an example of her, and so with all her surviving soldiers gathered in a field not far from the castle, the Norman commander condemned her to death by beheading. I pictured an old wooden block and a big executioner's axe, like how Sean Bean gets a little off the top in the first season of Game of Thrones. Spoiler alert. But according to Ray, that's not how it happened. A Norman soldier, right there in front of all of Gwenllian's men, took a dagger from its sheath and sliced through her neck so slowly that she drowned in her own blood rather than enjoying a quick and painless death. When the dagger reached Gwen's spine, It wasn't sharp enough to cut through, so the soldier resorted to twisting and pulling, breaking the wretched woman's neck before he quite literally tore her head from her shoulders. And by the end of his retelling, I remember thinking, no wonder the poor woman's spirit can't rest, and Ray agreed. He said her ghost still wandered the castle walls, racked with the guilt of failure and plagued by the agonizing memory of her own brutal execution. Now naturally, Ray thought that his best chance of getting an actual ghost documentation, as in like recording one on camera, was a night in Kidwelly Castle. I told him I couldn't promise anything, as I had no experience or belief in recording otherworldly spirits, and so he assured me that that wasn't a problem. All I had to do was stay close, do as he asked, and point the camera where needed. Everything else was on him. Now, to my surprise, Ray was actually really professional. He had ideas for scenes, he had little speeches memorized when he hit different parts of the castle, and he even had us rehearse little drills for whenever Phil, the tech guy, got readings on his instruments. I was impressed, like really impressed, and as the sun went down and a shooting started, it felt more like we were making a proper documentary than just filming an amateur ghost hunt. They had a lot of fun doing it too, and that definitely transferred onto the footage. I remember thinking their viewers must have had a lot of fun watching, but in terms of seeing any actual ghosts, no prizes for assuming we didn't see any. We'd made our way around the castle grounds with Ray talking about all the various battles that had been fought over it, as well as the brutal beheading of Gwenllian. But like I said, there were no real ghosts, no orbs, or no unusual readings on any of Phil's equipment, and we made it all the way up to the battlements, which by that point was just a small stretch of walkway hemmed in by iron railings for safety, accessible by a spiral staircase that was as deep as it was narrow. And before we went up, Ray instructed Phil to do a loop on the castle at ground level with his equipment, just to see if there were any readings he might have missed. And after that, me, Ray, and Sophie ascended the stairs, very carefully I should add, and then started to shoot a scene on the battlements. It was obviously dark out, but my camera's light illuminated the battlements quite nicely, and we ended up with a really nice shot as Ray pointed off into the field and spoke about the spectral battles that locals claimed to see. It was all a load of bollocks if you ask me, but I wasn't there to pass judgment or offer an opinion. I was there to shoot, nothing more, nothing less. So when Ray suddenly stopped talking in the middle of a sentence and looked out into the dark field away from the battlements, I did nothing but keep filming him. With his flair of dramatics and not believing in any of that ghosty stuff, I honestly thought Ray was just sort of pretending to see something when he said, Oh my gosh, I see something." Sophie started looking out towards where he was pointing, asking where, but Ray didn't respond. He just kept on looking out into the darkness with this shocked look on his face. Keeping the shot on him, I looked off into the darkness to try and see what he was looking at, but there was nothing. Just this big, dark field, barely lit by what little moonlight made its way through the clouds. Ray suddenly turned to me and told me, rather frantically, to get a shot of the field and what he was looking at. I obviously did as he asked, but there was nothing but darkness, and my camera didn't pick up anything at all. I kept the shot on the field for a couple of more seconds, purely to please Ray, and then as Sophie asked what he could see, I instinctively turned the shot back to them to capture the exchange. Without taking his big, frightened eyes off the field, Ray started explaining to Sophie how he could see Gwenllian out there, kneeling in front of her Norman executioner. And Sophie asked, "Where?" Then Ray, pointing again, all frustrated, and shouted, "Right bloody there." Sophie didn't say anything in response, something I suppose she often did whenever Ray claimed to have seen something. I assumed there were a lot of exchanges like this, with Sophie keeping her mouth shut for the good of her job, and I followed suit and simply panned back towards the field to where Ray was pointing. I heard him say, "It's her! It's her! No, wait, it's..." And then he went quiet for a second. I panned back to him, hoping I could catch whatever he was going to say next, and the look on his face was nothing short of haunting. Ray looked terrified. I mean, truly and traumatically terrified, more so than I'd have ever seen on the faces of soldiers coming under fire. Then, in a voice that shook with the fear that he was feeling, he said, and I'll never forget the sound of it, That's Ava down there. That's my little girl." I lost the shot completely as he barged his way past me, with Sophie calling after him as he went. He reached the top of the stairs, then started hurtling down with them, with Sophie close behind shouting, "Ray? Ray, slow down!" I tried my best to capture what was happening, but I got nothing but a shot of Sophie chasing after Ray as he ran for the stairs. I tried to follow as fast as I could, but it's not easy to hold a camera steady if you're moving faster than walking speed. And then before I could get a single steady shot of anything, I heard a brief yelp from Ray before Sophie suddenly screamed out his name. Or more like she screeched it, so loud and with such terror that it was like nails on a chalkboard to my ears. And that's when I heard the sound of him tumbling down stone stairs, like a scuffling, a yelp, and then these dull cracks as he hit the literal rock hard steps over and over. I stopped trying to record things after that. Thankfully, the stairs were in a spiral shape, so he didn't go flying all the way down, but I knew he'd picked up a nasty injury before I saw him because Sophie's screams somehow shifted up a gear when she saw the blood. At least I thought it was just blood she could see, because when I got down to where she and Ray were, with her standing over him as he was splayed out on the stairs, I realized that the damage was way worse than just a few cuts and bruises. Ray must have smashed his head against a step on the way down, and while they'd been worn down after nearly 1,000 years of use, they still had these sharp, almost jagged edges in places and were made of the hardest of local stone. Corella stone, in fact. Stone that was obviously considered harder than Ray's skull. I don't think I'll ever forget following Sophie's torch beam with my eyes only to see a horrifying amount of blood pouring down that same stone steps. Ray had cracked his head open, and I don't mean that with any sense of exaggeration. There was a clear and terrifying split to his scalp, through which I could see blood, bone, and something paler and whiter which glistened under the light of Sophie's torch. Phil had heard the scream too by that point and had come running to see what was going on. He was the one to call 999, the one to rush off to where we'd parked the cars so he could guide the paramedics to where Ray was lying bleeding. That's mostly why I still feel a lot of affection and respect for the man. I'd rather foolishly believed him useless with all of those strange little gadgets and gizmos, but without him, without his cool head where my own and Sophie's were lost in a panic, I'm almost certain Ray would no longer be with us. And at that moment, I was almost certain he was dead. It seemed impossible to me that anyone could survive such a horrific injury, but somehow he did. After the mad rush to the hospital with Sophie joining him in the ambulance and Phil telling me to jump into his passenger seat, we were told that the chances of Ray's survival were relatively high. I think they said something about him being put into a coma so they could handle the swelling to his brain, but the bottom line was that after a couple of days, he'd be awake and most likely healthy again. That was obviously really great news, and so great that I was able to start driving back home with enough peace of mind to keep from crashing, but sadly, we didn't get the happy ending I thought we would. I kept in touch with Sophie and Phil, hoping to carry on hearing all the good news about Ray's recovery, but as I said, the news wasn't good. Apparently he had this thing called post-concussion syndrome, and by the sounds of it, it was bad. Ray was having trouble remembering things about the recent past. For example, he couldn't remember what he'd seen that had frightened him in the minutes before he fell down the stairs at the Kidwelly. Sophie said that no one ever told him the full story, that he'd seen the ghost of his daughter out there, and to be honest, I should have probably seen this coming. I thought Ray was hallucinating, that he was ill, mentally I mean, and he'd legitimately hallucinated something like the way people with brain tumors do. But Ray really did have a daughter, and she'd lost her life as a teenager many years before after a long battle with leukemia. Sophie said the loss of his daughter was the whole reason Ray had become interested in ghost hunting in the first place, to prove to himself that there was some kind of afterlife or method of communicating with his deceased daughter. It was only once I was told this that I realized how, in a manner of speaking, I'd been right about him being mentally ill. Only it wasn't some condition or a tumor driving him mad. It was grief. Grief that was making him see things and react in ways that were quite literally putting his life in danger. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.